Hello hockey fans and welcome back to another video. Being selected at the NHL Entry Draft is a rite of passage for the vast majority of future NHL players, and while most prospects will make a single appearance at the event, some players will enter the draft a second time too. In fact, since the draft was introduced 59 years ago, 92 players have been selected twice, with 10 of them being chosen by the exact same team that had taken them the first time around. Because that makes sense, doesn't it? Though most NHL prospects are drafted once, twice, or even never at all, one player would hear his name called several times more. This is the story of Stefan Nilsson, the NHL prospect who was drafted 4 different times. Now, in order to tell this fascinating tale, we must first travel back to the 1985-86 season, where a young Swede by the name of Stefan Nilsson was having quite the year for himself. After all, the 17-year-old forward had potted 5 points in 5 games at the European Junior Championships, the precursor to the Under-18 World Championships, had spent much of the season with Luleå HF's Under-20 team, and had even earned a 4-game stint with Luleå's men's team in the Elite Serien, the precursor to the Swedish Hockey League. Thanks to his impressive season in his homeland and his strong performance on the international stage, Nilsson would be selected at the NHL Entry Draft, as he was taken 124th overall in the 1986 event by the Washington Capitals. Despite being drafted by an NHL team and earning an opportunity to join the show, this partnership wouldn't last for very long, as the two sides were unable to come to terms on a deal, and Nilsson would never sign a contract with Washington. Because of this, Nilsson would leave the Capitals organization, continue his career in Sweden, and re-enter the draft over the coming years. Not the conclusion that Washington would have liked, but Nilsson was a 6th round draft pick, so I doubt that they were too upset to lose him, you know. The next 2 years of Nilsson's career would see the forward remain in Sweden and develop into quite the effective player back home. After all, the former 6th round pick would spend this entire tenure in the Elite Serien, score 33 points in 54 games for Luleå HF, and register 7 points in 12 games during various international tournaments too. Considering that he was putting up strong scoring numbers against the best players in Sweden, and considering that he was still a teenager at the time, Nilsson certainly could have done a lot worse for himself, couldn't he? Having potted 21 points in 31 games during the 1987-88 season, and having firmly established himself as a productive player back home, Nilsson had caught the attention of several NHL teams. Though he would make himself available for the 1988 NHL Draft, and he would enter the event for a second time, Nilsson would soon become the subject of one of the most confusing draft stories in NHL history. As the 1988 draft got underway, Nilsson awaited to hear which team had taken him and where in the draft order they had done so. After nearly 7 rounds of selection, he would finally get his answer, as Nilsson was drafted 147th overall by the Calgary Flames. While most draft picks would breathe a huge sigh of relief and begin celebrating their achievement, Nilsson's night wasn't over just yet. Almost 5 rounds after his selection, Nilsson would hear his name called once again, this time by the Vancouver Canucks at 233rd overall. But wait a minute, Nilsson had already been drafted by Calgary. How was he selected by Vancouver as well? Well, as it turns out, Calgary had drafted the wrong player. During the 1988 NHL Draft, there were 2 different Stefan Nilssons that were eligible to be selected. One that played for Luleå HF, and the other that played for HV71. While the Flames intended to draft the Nilsson from Luleå, they accidentally picked the Nilsson from HV71 instead, perhaps because they didn't realise that there were 2 different players with the same name who had played in the same league that year. While Calgary would immediately argue their case to the NHL and try to secure the Nilsson that they actually wanted, the league refused to get involved, so Calgary was stuck with the other Nilsson instead. To make matters even more confusing, there was a 3rd Stefan Nilsson that was also eligible for the 1988 draft, and all 3 of these Stefan Nilssons played for Sweden at the World Junior Championships that year. Talk about a commentator's nightmare. Though the real Nilsson would be drafted by Vancouver and he would become a member of the Canucks organisation, the forward would follow an almost identical path to his tenure with the Capitals, as he never signed a contract with Vancouver in the many years that followed. In fact, Nilsson would never make the move across the pond at any point during his tenure with the Canucks, so he really wasn't worth all that trouble at the draft, was he? However, Nilsson's days of being drafted weren't over just yet. Having heard his name selected 3 times in the last 2 years and having refused to sign with Vancouver, Nilsson would remain in Sweden and continue to carve out an impressive career in the elite Syrian. Not only would he spend the next decade of his career playing exclusively with Luleå and score 378 points in 392 regular season games, the 12th round draft pick would serve as captain of Luleå's roster for 6 consecutive seasons between 1992 and 1998. Oh, and he also won an elite Syrian championship in 1996, secured a silver medal finish twice, and led the entire league in assists on 3 separate occasions. So I think this decision paid off for him, and then some. After playing his 13th year with Luleå during the 1997-98 season, and after leading the team in scoring once again, Nilsson would take his talents to Austria and join EC Klagenfurt for the following year of play, where he would end up spending the next 2 seasons of his career and register a whopping 169 points in just 99 games during that span. Though he had produced his fair share of success over the last few years, and he had spent his entire pro career in Europe, Nilsson would experience one last brush with the NHL. On June 23, 2000, the NHL held an expansion draft for its 2 newest franchises, the Columbus Blue Jackets and the Minnesota Wild. As the event wound to a close and the teams picked their final few players, a familiar name would be called. With the 48th pick in the 2000 expansion draft, the Minnesota Wild selected none other than Stefan Nilsson. So nearly a decade and a half after first being selected at the NHL Entry Draft, and roughly 12 years after being taken twice at one event, Stefan Nilsson had just been chosen by his 4th NHL team. But how was Nilsson eligible to be selected, and why would Minnesota draft him? Surely they could have chosen someone better, right? Well, to answer the how, since there was no transfer agreement between the NHL and the elite Syrian, NHL teams held the rights of their European draft picks indefinitely, so Nilsson's contract rights were still owned by the Canucks during the 2000 expansion draft. Because of this, Nilsson was eligible to be chosen at the event, despite never playing for the Canucks in the 12 years since being selected by the team at the entry draft. Now, to answer the why, Nilsson was selected by the Wild as a money-saving move for the team. Once Minnesota and Columbus reached their final few picks of the expansion draft, the 2 sides had already selected the players that they actually wanted to draft at the event. But since they were required to pick 2 players from every NHL team, they each used their later picks on players that wouldn't join their organisation and whom they wouldn't have to pay over the coming seasons. After all, Nilsson was 32 years old when he was selected by Minnesota, and he had spent his entire career in Europe. The Wild weren't choosing him because they wanted him to make their team, were they? By drafting Nilsson, Minnesota ensured that they had taken a player that they would never have to sign, and they had fulfilled another requirement at the draft, so it was nothing more than them ticking a box on their to-do list. Having been drafted by an NHL team for the 4th and final time, Nilsson would spend the rest of his career in Europe and continue to carve out an impressive tenure in some of the top domestic leagues across the continent. After spending a lone year in the Swiss National League following his selection by the Wild, Nilsson would return to Luleå HF for the 2001-02 season. From there, the Swedish forward would play the final 3 years of his career with his hometown side, serve as alternate captain of the roster every season, and score 78 points in 121 games, before retiring from the sport after the 03-04 season at the age of 36. Though he would hang up his skates for good, Nilsson's long and successful tenure in Sweden would cement his place in the league's history books, as his 489 points in 572 elite Syrian games rank him 9th place on the league's all-time scoring list. He may not have suited up in the NHL, but he certainly reached legend status back home. Once he had called it a day on his career, Nilsson would spend the following decade away from the sport before returning to his hometown team once again, as he was named head coach of Luleå HF's under-18 team for the 2012-13 season. After 2 years in the role, Nilsson would be promoted to assistant coach of the men's team and spend 2 seasons on the job before being hired as the head coach for the 2016-17 season. However, after posting an 11, 15, 5 and 7 record during his debut year as bench boss, Nilsson was removed from the position and promoted to general manager for the rest of the season, a job he has held for the last 6 years and a role he continues to serve during the current 22-23 season. If all of that wasn't impressive enough though, Nilsson would also receive one of the greatest honours a hockey player can, as on January 6th, 2015, Luleå HF raised Nilsson's iconic number 4 into their rafters and retired his jersey from the organisation. There's certainly worse ways for your career to be honoured, that's for sure. Though he never made his way across the pond and he never suited up in the best league in the world, Stefan Nilsson made quite the impact on the NHL's history books. After all, the guy was chosen 3 different times at the entry draft, was taken during the 2000 expansion draft, and he was subject to one of the most ridiculous stories in draft history. There aren't many players that can boast such a fascinating tenure in the show, and they played in the league for quite some time. Say what you want about his career or the decisions he made along the way, but having your name called by 4 different NHL franchises, producing a legendary tenure in Sweden, and having your jersey retired by your hometown team sounds like a pretty incredible journey if you ask me. And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was the story of the NHL prospect that was drafted 4 different times. What do you guys think about Stefan Nilsson's unique achievement or his storied career in Europe? Do you think that he was right to stay in Sweden, or do you think he should have tried his luck in the show? Let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys think. But thank you very much for watching guys, I hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye! A big thank you to Bexy93, Burned Retinas, Clayton Hallam, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.